My name's Timothy Bennett. I'm with Drummond Group, Director of Strategic Healthcare Initiatives, and I have with me Rakesh Mathew, who is with Height Health. And we're going to talk about testing fire at scale and uh, really focused on interoperability testing. Rakesh, you want to introduce yourself? Just say,
Hi, everyone. My background is in healthcare interoperability. I've been in healthcare for almost 2 decades now, and I've seen some journeys from HL7V2 to CCDA and now to FHIR. And as adoption increases from the payer side and from the provider side, a key component is testing and testing at scale. We were lucky to be one of the early participants in FHIRplace. We're going to hear a little bit more about FHIRplace and what the Drummond Group is doing. I'm here representing multiple payers who are actually testing solutions through FHIRplace.
yep. And so my background is with Drummond Group. We've been doing health IT testing and certification since the Meaningful Use program got off the ground with the ONC criteria. But Drummond has been in business since really the advent of the internet for business use. So 99, 2000, we were helping different domains, different industries become interoperable as they began to exchange secure business documents over the internet. When we got involved in health IT testing in the early 2010s, we noticed that healthcare didn't really do interoperability testing the way other industries did. And we were sort of just waiting for, well, how can Drummond sort of, and when can Drummond sort of bring some of our expertise in this area into the healthcare space? We really sort of waited until FHIR really began to take off and began to kind of show that, it's a viable technology for secure health data exchange. And then as it began to ramp up with these more complicated, complex use cases around FHIR, electronic prior authorization, and payer data exchange, some of these Da Vinci items that started showing up in CMS regulations like 0057, 9115 before that, we realized the time was right for Drummond to begin to bring some of our expertise, our tooling, our understanding and knowledge of how to help industries become not just conformant to standards, but interoperable, because there is this gap. Many people can implement the same standard, but when you start talking about complex use cases like in FHIR, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be interoperable and they're going to work with each other in the real world. It's a much more complex. And so we sort of brought our full matrix testing, many to many testing paradigm into FHIR. We're calling it FHIRplace. It's a place where FHIR implementers and end users like payers, providers, intermediaries, and all their technology providers can come and find testing partners that they can test with. The idea is that this is really only going to work if we're actually having the implementations test with each other, not just with a test tool that tests for conformance. That's important. And go into connectathons and go into pilot projects. That's all important too. But the next step now is to prove that this can operate at scale in the real world the way that it's going to be tested. And so the idea here is that we want to bring payers, provider implementations together, testing through intermediaries, and that includes QHINs and other kinds of intermediaries. That's how it's going to work in the real world, and that's how we need to test and test it at scale. So, Rakesh, to sort of kickstart our conversations here about testing FHIR at scale, our idea here, this is sort of a diagram of how FHIRplace testing happens. At the center and the core of testing at Drummond Group, we believe the intermediary is the key central location. We don't want to introduce tooling that gets in the way of FHIR endpoints testing with each other, because that's not how it's going to work in the real world. They're not going to be testing against a test tool They're not going to be exchanging transactions through a test tool. They're going to be exchanging transactions through intermediaries, through QHINs, through HIEs, that sort of thing. And so what we want to do is we want to not get in the way of those transactions that are happening between providers and payers, or between payers and the intermediaries and the trusted networks that they belong to. Let that traffic happen the way it's going to work in the real world. And then through a connector, Drummond can get access to those transactions and then use that to manage a test environment that we can do, analyze the data or initiate test cases, whatnot. So, and then do all kinds of other analysis on it, whether that's data quality analysis that no one's doing or conformance testing, that sort of thing. So let me hand it off to you, Rakesh, and you can kind of talk about it.
So one of the key things, this is the future of many of the HIEs out there that are either regional or statewide. This is where they can actually think about sustainability, think about the next iteration of being the link between payers and providers. So this architecture is really sound in the sense that this is how real world implementation of prior authorization will really happen. Thinking about point-to-point connections between payers and providers is not scalable. You can do one-off and you can do one use case here and there, but if you want to scale for a whole state, this is the way to go. And what FHIRplace brings to the table is a bunch of providers and payers who are playing in a sandbox and working out these unique use cases and workflow. At the end of the day, the CRD DTR pass is what it is. And everything that we have tested so far in the connectathons are happy paths. Now we need to have to start looking at edge cases and moving beyond the comfort zone. And this is one of the best examples that I have seen so far in the industry, where you're bringing in different organizations and making sure that existing infrastructure, especially the HIE infrastructure, QHIN infrastructure, is leveraged for this.
Yeah, and as I talk to many different, the ecosystem in healthcare is vast. There's all kinds of different players, especially when we start talking about prior authorization, clearinghouses. What are your role, which has traditionally been, let's say, X12? And by the way, no one's talking about testing X12 with FHIR right now. There's a lot of hand waving going on with that, right? Well, we want to do that. We want to find out, does this work? Where are the interoperability issues? Even what is your role in this new future world that includes FHIR? And I think the industry has to figure that out. And one of the ways that we can figure this out is by creating this ecosystem that mimics or simulates the real world, and not only test to find out where the gaps are and where the interoperability issues are, but also help the industry in your various role figure out and understand what is your role in the new FHIR world with these complex use cases. And I think that that's a value, because no one's really even talking about that aspect of it either. And when I talk to clearinghouses or I talk to HIEs, they have a sense that they have a role in this, in the FHIR world, but they're not even really sure what that looks like. And so I think that that's an important thing to do. So, you, Rakesh, saw the value of it initially. You want to kind of talk about that maybe at a different level than you did before?
We started prior authorization testing, CRD DTR pass testing back in 2023. From a regulatory perspective, it had not come out. And once we got into 2024, we got very active with HL7 workgroup and also different connectathons. We went through multiple cycles with some prominent EMR vendors. But what we ended up doing was pretty much the repetition of the same use case, right? Again, as I was saying before, it was always the happy path. Can we do a CRD? Can we do a DTR? Can we do a pass? And it was usually a checkbox, and we would move on to the next connectathon. We were not actually improving our knowledge or the capability, And from a product perspective, it was not improving the underlying products that we were doing. So when FHIRplace came to be, one of the first questions that I to Tim was, well, who all are going to be there? And Tim's response is, it's not about who all are going to be there. It's that they're going to be there for more than 3 days. So the key thing is connectathons usually, 2-day events, 3-day events, and then people go back and come back after 4 months and do another one. It's not a continuation. So I think one of the key attractions for us was the fact that it was continuous testing and new partners were coming on board. So it really made sense for us to get involved.
This aspect of continuous testing, I think, is, first of all, it's really important and not to be devalued. Drummond, I mentioned earlier, we've been doing interoperability testing in other domains. We started that in the early 2000s. We are still doing that interoperability testing 25 years later, because interoperability is not just a test that you do for a weekend, or it's not just what we do until there's some 2027 or 2028 regulatory deadline. It's a thing that has to happen over and over and over again, because one, the market matures, the standards change, products change, new products enter into the marketplace, they leave. And when you think about interoperability at the ecosystem level, it's not just about one product being conformant, which is the way we think about certification testing for 10 or 15 years now. It's not about a product in a vacuum being certified to a test tool. It's about the whole community continuously being recognized as being interoperable. And in order to do that, we have to build a way to test that's for the next 20 years, for the next 25 years. EPA, prior authorization is it's the thing we're doing now. But in 5 years, it's going to be price, patient cost transparency. And then 5 years after that, it's going to be another complex use case. And so there will always be more complicated FHIR technologies to test like this, and the versions change. And so being able to do continuous testing all the time is going to be important. So Rakesh, what do you see as the value to your own company, to the companies that you work with? What kind of outcomes do you expect to achieve with testing like this, just for your own ROI?
So Hike Health is a vendor agnostic implementer of different technologies. So we work very closely with Smile Digital Health, with FHIRly, with 8box. We also work with Microsoft and AWS on their FHIR servers. So from our perspective, we have to make the solutions work. And the more we engage with different payers, different providers, and the more we see some of the challenges in real world implementation, we can give that feedback back to the vendors that are actually producing the product. They can choose to add those features or enhancements, or let the implementation vendor deal with it in real life implementations. No matter what we do in the real world, every implementation is going to have some level of nuance. And from a product perspective, you may not be able to meet all those requirements, because EMR vendors, of course, they have to follow the standard, but they are not going to follow the standard really till 2028, because the HTI 5 requires them to do CRD, DTR, and pass, but that is in 2028. So till 2028, it's probably going to be a little bit of a wild, wild west. We also think that the use of Smart on FHIR apps are going to be important. There is a component that we also put out there that EMR vendors can adopt and go get started immediately. But in the long run, I think we're going to have more players come into FHIRplace and do some real testing so that we can actually do it with the APIs and not have to make it work in the end.
That feedback that you were talking about, even to your own vendors, our experience in doing interoperability testing at Drummond, and at Drummond, we're like a neutral third party, right? And that's why we have a reputation in our O&C testing, and that's why we're an agent of ONC, ASTP to do that, is that's our role. We're neutral, we're a third party. But as we test at scale, as we find interoperability issues, and as a community, as a FHIRplace community, as a representative of the industry, solve those interoperability issues, those then become sort of guidance, best practices for other products and other entities to come that adopt FHIR and then become part of the. You need someone to curate those best practices. Not everything can be solved by just making the standard better. There will be interoperability issues that we can fix by making the standards better, but being interoperable is beyond the standards as well, because that's the way the real world is. And so what we've learned along the way is that there will be an adjacent set of practices to the standards that says, in order for these standards to work in the real world, you have to do X, Y, and Z in addition to the standard. And how do we propagate that? How do we let the rest of the ecosystem know? How do we manage that over time? How do we curate that? You kind of need a neutral third party to do that. And that's sort of Drummond's role in the places, to help facilitate the testing, but also to help educate and keep the industry going. So another question here is, I guess, part of what we're doing here is we're going to do structured testing. We have test plans, we have test cases. As we automate the testing, we'll scale to tens of thousands of tests, because there's that many kinds of different service requests and clinical labs and whatever. There's all kinds of code systems that are going to have to be tested. This has to be done in a structured way. What kind of led you to think about testing that way instead of just kind of how we do it right now at the connectathons?
So one of the interesting things is that in addition to Da Vinci, we are also involved in the Codex Accelerator of HL7. And once we really started to understand the complexity of prior authorization in the oncology space, our eyes widened, right? We have not seen anything like that. We definitely built a demo for an oncology use case to support Codex, but that's when we realized we haven't even scraped the surface of the different permutations and combinations for these prior authorizations. That actually was like a primer for us to start looking for opportunities where we could get into more complex testing. So one of the hopes that I have is that FHIRplace will incorporate some of these things from Codex. And even today, I was having a conversation with the chief medical officer at a pair. He just realized that Part B drugs are also included as part of this prior auth. Part D is not included, but Part B is. And he's like, oh, man, so we're going to get all of these infusion requests coming in, and we have a higher denial rate for this. Oh, we need to automate. Like, that's actually starting conversations about, okay, I have a manual process today. I need to automate it. How can technology make it easier? How can the guidelines be better incorporated into the workflow? All of those conversations are happening at the payer's side today. And the only way that we can expose these things is to actually have some of these tests and probably some demonstrations of, okay, this is how a combination of 4 drugs for chemotherapy needs to get approved. 2 got approved automatically, 2 needs prior auth. And how do you actually put all of them together, right? So these are kind of things that kind of led.
Yeah, and we're members of Codex at Drummond as well. We definitely have plans to incorporate prior auth oncology use cases in there. If you're familiar with how durable medical equipment prior authorization happens, that's a whole different animal in of itself. So again, there's just it seems to be no end to the different permutations of the work cases, of the use cases that we can have. We could talk about scalable FHIR testing all day. We only have a certain amount of time to do that. Let me just say that as we sort of wrap up, the goal of FHIRplace is not just to sort of do FHIR testing in the general, but be flexible enough to where if you're a state and you're adopting FHIR technology for your, specific network of providers and payers, FHIRplace can be a solution for you to come and test your own network. If you are a QHIN, if you are a payer like Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever, and you want to test your specific use cases, we're adaptable to be able to take on, the generic use cases or very specific use cases with a specific network of providers and payers and their intermediaries. So we feel like we're trying to future-proof testing and make it flexible for where the industry is at, for where they are at different times in the future. So thanks, Rakesh, for joining us and all the words you had to say. And thanks a lot.